My name is Cassandra Powell. I am 33 years old. Last Christmas morning, my half-sister added me to the family group chat by mistake. I sat on my office floor and read 52 messages planning a luxury holiday in Maine without me. My stepmother Eleanor wrote, "Make sure Cassandra doesn't find out." My biological father Arthur replied with a laughing emoji. They were planning to sell my late grandfather's rare book collection for $420,000 behind my back. They forgot one thing. God. A legal document signed by my grandfather 12 years ago that froze their entire lives. I sent one reply into that chat. "Merry Christmas. The sheriff's deputy will explain the rest." Welcome back to Her Dignity Stories. If stories about dignity, family betrayal, and standing up for yourself are why you're here, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Now grab a warm drink, leave the noise behind, sit comfortably, and let me tell you what happened. It was 9:45 p.m. on a freezing Tuesday in mid-December. The snow outside the Boston Public Library was coming down at 2 inches an hour, down in the basement archive room. The only sound was the hum of the old climate control intake. I was sitting under a fluorescent bulb with my blue nitrile gloves on. My back ached from leaning over a stainless steel work table for 5 straight hours. With my right hand, I held a specialized scalpel, slowly scraping yellowed, brittle acid glue off the corner of an 1804 maritime map. If my hand slipped by 1 millimeter, a piece of American history would tear like tissue paper. I work with physical facts, raw data, and structural reality. Then, my iPhone buzzed right next to my tray of chemical solvents. The screen lit up with a notification from iCloud. My half-sister, Regina, had just added my old college email address to a group chat. The group was titled Powell Holiday Gathering. Regina is reckless with technology, and she obviously forgot I still get push notifications for that old account on my current phone. I kept my gloves on and used my knuckle to tap the screen open. There were 52 unread messages stretching back to November. I didn't blink as I started scrolling from the very top. My stepmother, Eleanor, had started the thread with a link to a luxury resort booking in Kennebunkport, Maine. She wrote, "The oceanfront suite is locked in for Christmas week." My biological father, Arthur, replied, "Perfect." The New York buyer confirmed he will meet us at the resort dining room on December 23rd. Eleanor typed right back, "He's bringing the certified check for $420,000 for the entire Silas collection." Then Regina added, "I already looked at 3 apartments in Manhattan. I need my share of the deposit by New Year's Eve." My chest went completely tight, cold like the winter air outside. They were selling my late grandfather's entire private library behind my back. Every single rare edition, every colonial manuscript Silas and I spent years cataloging together. I kept scrolling down to last Tuesday's timestamp. Eleanor had sent a message that read, "Make sure that girl Cassandra doesn't find out. She'll use her city preservation laws to freeze the sale and ruin our lives. Eel." Right below that, my own father replied with a plain, neutral, smiley face emoji. The very next morning, my father had sent a personal email directly to my work inbox. I remember the subject line clearly, "Holiday plans." He told me that they were remodeling the kitchen in Salem this year. He said money was tight, so they weren't doing a family dinner. He wrote, "Just stay in Boston and get some rest. Sweetie, we will catch up in January." I stared at the black smiley face on my chat screen, then at the scalpel in my hand. My family had spent 3 weeks coordinating a lie to strip away my grandfather's legacy. The basement room felt completely silent, like an empty tomb. I didn't yell, and I didn't text the chat to let them know I was there. I calmly took off my gloves, picked up my phone, and took a screenshot of every single one of those 52 messages. I opened my secure work laptop, created a new encrypted local folder, and dragged the images inside. I named the folder Archived Betrayal. A lot of people react with tears when their blood treats them like an unwanted stranger. But when you spend your life handling fragile things, you learn exactly how to handle a total break. I grew up in that big, drafty Gothic house on Essex Street in Salem. To the neighbors, my father, Arthur, was a refined man who appreciated history. To me, he was just a man who liked the look of old things but hated the cost of maintaining them. When he married Eleanor, the house filled with fake white orchids and expensive soy candles. They spent 10 years pretending they were local royalty while the roof shingles rotted. I chose a career that does not allow for performance or lies. As an archival conservator, I look at reality under a high-powered magnifying lamp. If a piece of paper has oak gall ink from 1750, it reacts a certain way to a drop of distilled water. If wood has dry rot, no amount of white paint will make it structurally sound. Facts are stubborn, and they do not care about your social standing. My family despised my work from the very beginning. Eleanor used to smell my clothes when I came home from my apprenticeship. She would pinch her nose and say I smelled like a wet basement and stale vinegar. Arthur called me a glorified paper scrubber and a waste of a Powell last name. But they had a completely different standard for my half-sister, Regina. Regina spent her 20s as an independent lifestyle consultant in Manhattan. That was just a fancy term for sleeping until noon and shopping at Saks on Arthur's credit cards. Every Sunday dinner, Eleanor would brag about Regina's new Instagram followers. Then she would look across the roast chicken at me and ask when I was going to get a real office job. The real isolation started 3 years ago during the local commercial real estate slump. Arthur's house-flipping business was drowning in high-interest bank debt. He and Eleanor called me into the library on a rainy Thursday night. They set a stack of legal papers on the mahogany desk and handed me a pen. Arthur wanted me to co-sign a $150,000 corporate bailout loan using my private restoration shop as collateral. I looked at the bank statements he tried to hide under his leather planner. The numbers were a disaster of unpaid supplier liens and maxed-out business lines. I stood up, slid the pen back across the desk, and said no. Eleanor's face turned instantly purple, and she screamed that I was an ungrateful parasite. Arthur didn't yell. He just looked at me with cold disgust and told me I was no longer part of his future plans. What they forgot was that I had already paid my dues to that family 10 times over. When I got into the graduate archive program at Simmons University, Arthur refused to pay a single dime. He told me the family funds were locked up in long-term investments. That same month, he wired $22,000 for Regina's security deposit on a 2-bedroom loft in Tribeca. I didn't complain, and I didn't beg him for a loan. I stayed in a cheap basement room in Alston with 2 roommates and a radiator that leaked steam. I woke up at 4:30 a.m. every day to scrub toilets at a commercial gym near Kenmore Square. Then I took 6 hours of classes and spent my nights working the night shift at a 24-hour copy shop. I bought my groceries at Aldi, counting every penny for boxes of generic mac and cheese. I paid every cent of my tuition in cash while Regina posted photos of her weekend trips to the Hamptons. I absorbed their insults, their dismissal, and their quiet exclusion for years. Every time they left me off a dinner invite, I just went back to my lab and focused on my work. The pressure inside my chest has been building like a steam boiler with a stuck valve. They thought my silence meant I was weak, and they thought my lack of drama meant I was defeated. But a professional conservator knows how to wait out the decay until the true structure is exposed. The old radiator in the corner of the basement clanked twice and let out a long, rusty hiss. I looked away from my laptop and stared at my own reflection in the small, cracked mirror hanging over the metal sink. My eyes looked tired under the harsh fluorescent light, and my fingers were still stained with a faint trace of charcoal powder. For 10 years, I had survived by focusing entirely on the damage left by other people. I knew how to fix dry rot in leather-bound diaries from the Civil War. I knew how to neutralize acid in 200-year-old paper so it wouldn't crumble into dust. I spent 40 hours a week saving the history of total strangers who had been dead for centuries. Yet, right there on my desk, a single group chat was showing me that my own family was tearing my life apart without a single regret. They didn't see me as a daughter or a sister. To Eleanor and Arthur, I was just an inconvenient line of text they needed to erase so they could clear a path to a checkbook. I walked over to my desk, picked up my heavy ceramic mug, and drank the last sip of my cold, black coffee. The bitterness hit the back of my throat, and it felt exactly like reality. If you have ever been the person who stayed up all night to keep your family's roof from collapsing, only to find out they hid the chest of gold they dug up from under the basement floor, then you know exactly what this second of silence feels like. You know the weight of realizing that the people who share your blood only value your existence when you are carrying their bags. If that specific kind of betrayal makes something shift inside your chest, take a second to hit the subscribe button and drop a comment below, because the truth always has a way of exposing the foundation. I sat back down in my squeaky vinyl office chair and looked at the green bubble on my phone screen. My thumb hovered right over the button that said Leave Group. That is what most people would do. They would exit the chat, block the numbers, and spend the night crying into a pillow or screaming into the void. But my training teaches me to never disturb a crime scene until you have documented every single piece of evidence. If I left that chat, they would know I was watching. They would change their passwords, move the meeting location, and cover their tracks before the first shovel hit the dirt. I didn't leave the group. I didn't type a single word of warning. I simply tapped the settings icon, scrolled down to the notifications menu, and flipped the switch to hide alerts. Then I set the phone face down on the blotter, right next to my row of steel micro spatulas. Over the next 3 hours, my phone's silver edge blinked repeatedly as the messages kept pouring in. I didn't open them, but I knew what they were doing. Eleanor was probably sending links to $300 cashmere sweaters she planned to buy on Newbury Street. Regina was likely posting screenshots of first-class flights to New York for her big move. Arthur was probably adding more emojis, feeling like a successful businessman again because he was about to liquidate his own father's soul. They were spending a fortune in their minds before the buyer even opened his fountain pen. They thought they had successfully locked the door and left me out in the blizzard with an empty bank account. But they didn't realize that when you lock someone out, you also lock yourself inside the room with whatever they left behind. I opened my logbook, picked up my fine point micron pen, and noted the exact time and date of the scan. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, heavy calculation that felt as solid as stone. They had spent years writing me out of their story. Now, I was going to let them finish the script. Right up until the moment I changed the ending. I spent 4 years watching how my family treated a dying man. In 2022, Grandpa Silas suffered a severe stroke and was diagnosed with advanced dementia. He was placed in a small, understaffed nursing home in rural Essex County. The facility smelled like industrial bleach and boiled cabbage. The very first week, Eleanor and Arthur claimed they were completely broke. Arthur told the facility director that his construction company had cash flow issues. Eleanor wept in the lobby, saying they couldn't afford the specialized care plan. They immediately tried to pass the entire responsibility down to me. I was only 29, working entry-level archive jobs, but I couldn't leave him there alone. Every single Saturday morning, I woke up at 5 a.m. I drove 3 long hours down the highway in the freezing rain or the summer heat. I spent my weekends sitting on a hard vinyl chair next to his metal bed. I dipped small pink sponges into ice water to clean his dry mouth. I changed his soiled bed sheets when the night staff forgot to check on him. I brought my own tools to trim his thick, yellowed fingernails. I spent hours reading old New England history books out loud so he could hear a familiar voice. Grandpa's Medicare didn't cover his advanced neurological medication. The extra out-of-pocket cost was exactly $1,200 every single month. The nursing home finance office gave me a strict 30-day ultimatum to pay the balance. I went home that night, emptied my tiny savings account, and realized it wasn't enough. The next afternoon, I drove my black 2012 Ford Mustang to a used car lot on Route 1. That car was my only valuable possession, something I bought with 3 years of savings. The dealer gave me a lowball offer of $8,500 because of a small dent on the rear bumper. I didn't argue. I didn't negotiate. And I signed the title over immediately. I used every dollar of that check to pay the pharmacy directly for his daily pills. While I was skipping meals to keep Grandpa comfortable, my family lived a completely different life. One Saturday afternoon, I was cleaning Grandpa's food tray when my phone chimed. I saw an Instagram notification from my half-sister, Regina. She had posted a photo of herself lying on a white beach chair in the Bahamas. She was holding a tropical drink with a little pink umbrella, wearing $400 designer sunglasses. Her caption read, "Thinking of my sweet grandpa Silas today. Please send your prayers." I closed the app and looked out the window at the gray Essex County parking lot. 2 days later, Arthur drove up to my apartment in Salem to drop off some of Grandpa's old tax forms. He didn't get out of his vehicle. He just rolled down the window of a brand new Escalade. It was a metallic silver Cadillac SUV with temporary dealer tags and leather seats. Arthur smiled at me and said, "Eleanor's back was hurting, so we had to trade in the old sedan." He didn't ask how I paid the nursing home bill, and he didn't offer a single dollar for gas. They used Grandpa's remaining personal pension fund to pay the lease deposit on that luxury truck. I kept my mouth shut, took the tax folder, and went back inside my apartment. The final breaking point came on a wet Thursday night in late October. The head nurse called me at midnight and said Grandpa Silas's vitals were dropping fast. I drove down the flooded highway, arriving at room 114 completely drenched in sweat. Grandpa Silas was breathing heavily, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling tiles. But at 2:15 a.m., his breathing suddenly stabilized, and his eyes cleared up completely. The confusion was entirely gone, and he looked at me with absolute recognition. He didn't see a paper scrubber. He saw the granddaughter who had stayed by his side. He didn't have the strength to speak, but his grip on my hand was surprisingly tight. With his left trembling finger, he pointed toward the wall behind his small bedside locker. There was a small framed print of a colonial Boston landscape hanging on a plastic hook. I stood up, walked over, and carefully lifted the frame away from the plaster. Behind it, inside a hollowed-out section of the drywall, was an old English biscuit tin. The metal lid was rusted shut and covered in fine white drywall dust. Grandpa nodded his head once, his eyes fixed on the box as he closed them for the last time. He passed away 20 minutes later while holding my hand in the quiet room. I sat with his body until the morning light hit the window pane. I took the tin box to my truck, used my pocket knife to pry open the rusted lid. Inside lay a heavy, oil-rubbed iron key with a square head. Underneath the key was an official yellowed paper receipt from the Essex County Registry. It was a certified copy of an estate filing dated exactly 12 years ago. My father and Eleanor had spent years planning to rob a dying man of his legacy, but Grandpa Silas had already built a legal wall around me before they ever bought their first lie. I drove back to my apartment with the rusted biscuit tin sitting securely on the passenger seat of my truck. My small studio apartment in South Boston was cold, and the radiator was buzzing loudly as usual. I tossed my wet jacket over a wooden chair and sat directly down at my small kitchen table. The blue light from my phone screen was still flashing with hidden group chat notifications, but I ignored it. I used a steel butter knife from my sink drawer to carefully pry open the dented, oxidized lid of the tin. A dry, metallic smell filled the small kitchen as the metal finally gave way with a sharp pop. Inside, wrapped in a simple grease-proof paper bag from a local hardware store, was a heavy iron key and a thick stack of papers. I pulled the documents out and flattened them on the white laminate table right under my desk lamp. This was not a standard, cheaply made last will and testament that any family lawyer could dispute in a local court. This was an official, irrevocable trust agreement, stamped and sealed by a highly prestigious international firm based in Zurich, Switzerland. The bottom of each page carried the heavy blue ink seal of the Essex County Registry of Deeds. Dated exactly 12 years ago, my grandfather Silas had built an absolute fortress of paperwork long before his memory started to fade. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the strict, dry legal terms that changed my entire reality. The text stated that the entire contents of the historical library, including the rare volumes and colonial navigation maps, belonged 100% to me. Furthermore, the document granted me sole legal ownership of the entire east wing of the Salem estate where the collection sat. Arthur and Eleanor did not own those books, and they never had the legal right to list them to any New York collector. According to the trust, my father only held a conditional life estate, which meant he could live in the house but could not touch a single brick of the library. They were currently drinking champagne and celebrating a $420,000 sale of an asset they held zero legal rights to execute. But as I turned to the final addendum of the document, my breath completely caught in my throat. Grandpa Silas was an incredibly smart man, and he knew exactly how greedy his own son could be. He had explicitly ordered his Swiss lawyers to insert a brutal technical clause deep into the insurance section of the agreement. The clause stated that if anyone moved or attempted to liquidate even one single volume from that room without a certified digital signature from me, a legal trigger would instantly activate. The moment a book left the threshold of the property illegally, Arthur's conditional life estate for the entire Salem house was instantly terminated. The full deed of the property would immediately transfer over to a public historical preservation trust in Boston within 24 hours. If my father signed that contract in Maine, he wasn't just committing a crime, he was legally evicting himself from his own home. They had spent 3 years treating me like an invisible employee who was too weak to fight back against their demands. They had hidden their holiday plans, lied about their finances, and laughed about my career choices in their secret messages. They thought they were the chess players, and they thought I was just a piece of paper they could throw away in the trash. But looking at the red notary stamp on the table, a deep, heavy feeling of relief finally washed over my chest. I didn't need to drive down to Kennebunkport in the middle of a blizzard to shout at them through a resort window. I didn't need to send frantic text messages begging my biological father to remember my name or respect his own father's memory. The law is cold. It is precise. And it doesn't care about a stepmother's dramatic performances or a sister's expensive lifestyle goals. Silas had left the entire weight of the family history in my hands, and he had given me the exact tool to balance the scales. I carefully folded the yellowed documents back into the greaseproof bag and slid them into my fireproof work safe under my bed. I picked up my iron key, held its heavy, cold weight tightly in my palm, and let out a long, quiet breath for the first time in years. The trap was completely set. The numbers were checked, and all I had to do now was let my family pull the string themselves. It was exactly 2 weeks before Christmas, and my lab desk was covered in a fresh batch of preservation blotters. My phone rang at 2:40 p.m., right as I was mixing a new batch of wheat starch paste. The caller ID said Eleanor, and my stomach instantly tightened into a hard knot. I hit the speaker button with my clean knuckle. Her voice came through the speaker, sounding as sweet as honey. But I knew the poison was already mixed in. Cassandra, sweetie, I hate to bother you at work, but we have a major family crisis. She sighed heavily into the receiver. Your father's arthritis is flaring up so badly he can barely walk down the stairs to the kitchen. The doctor recommended a specialized orthopedic therapy machine, but our insurance won't cover a single dime of it. It costs exactly $5,000, and your father is too proud to ask you himself because he knows money is tight for everyone. The family business is completely drained this month, and we are just totally desperate. Honey, I sat there in my white lab coat, listening to her practiced, trembling voice. Just 3 hours earlier, my hidden group chat had blinked with a message from Regina. Regina had sent a photo from a high-end boutique on Newbury Street, standing in front of a mirror. She was wearing a silver, crystal-encrusted evening gown that cost exactly $4,950 before taxes. Eleanor had replied to that photo in the chat. You look like an angel. Regina, don't worry about the price. Your father and I will wire the cash to your account by Monday morning. Now, Eleanor was on the phone with me, using her sweet, maternal tone to extract that exact amount from my bank account. Are you still there, Cassandra? Eleanor asked, her voice suddenly losing its softness, turning sharp and cold. I know you like to pretend you are independent up there in Boston, but your father is practically begging for help. You always hide in that dusty archive room and ignore this family until you need something from us. Don't be so incredibly selfish and ungrateful. Cassandra, your father gave you your life, and now he is suffering while you save your pennies. The gaslighting was heavy, suffocating, and designed to make me feel like a monster for hesitating. She wanted me to feel guilty for working hard, saving my money, and living in a modest studio apartment. If a family member called you out of the blue, lied to your face about a medical emergency, and called you an ungrateful child just to steal your hard-earned money for a party dress, what would you do? Would you lose your temper and scream the truth at them? Or would you quietly play along to see how far their greed would take them? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because I truly want to know how you handle people who treat your kindness like an open ATM. If you believe that no one has the right to use guilt to empty your pockets, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can keep standing up for our own worth together. I took a slow, deep breath, keeping my voice completely flat and professional. I understand, Eleanor, I said, looking down at my workspace. I will take care of the $5,000 balance before the weekend starts, so don't worry about Arthur's situation. Eleanor let out a loud gasp of relief, her voice instantly returning to that fake, sugary sweetness. Oh, thank you, sweetie. I knew you had a good heart somewhere under that cold exterior. Just wire it to my personal checking account at Bank of America by 5 o'clock today, okay? I will handle the transfer myself, I replied evenly, and I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I didn't open my banking app, and I didn't send a single penny to Eleanor's personal account. Instead, I opened my secure county workstation and logged directly into the Essex County Property Tax Database. I searched the parcel number for the Salem estate and pulled up the public financial records. Just as I suspected, Arthur was 14 months behind on his municipal property taxes, and the county had just issued a final foreclosure warning. The total amount of back taxes, interest, and late penalties owed to the state was exactly $5,120. I clicked the button that said Pay Total Balance, entered my corporate routing numbers, and authorized the full payment. 10 minutes later, the system generated an official, certified tax lien certificate under my legal name. According to Massachusetts state law, by paying off their delinquent debt directly to the government, I had just become the primary lien holder on the Salem property. If Arthur and Eleanor didn't pay me back that exact amount with a statutory 16% interest penalty within 24 hours of notice, I had the legal right to seize the deed. I printed out the official document with the heavy red county seal, slid it into a clean manila envelope, and locked it in my desk drawer. Eleanor thought she had successfully manipulated me into paying for her favorite daughter's luxury lifestyle. She thought I was still the quiet, broken girl who would write a check just to buy a piece of fake family peace. But the air in my basement lab didn't feel suffocating anymore. It felt incredibly clear and crisp. They wanted to use my money to fund their grand performance in Maine, but they didn't look at the foundation of their own house. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, picked up my scalpel, and went right back to work on my map. It was exactly 7:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve. Outside the towering glass windows of the Tides Beach Club in Kennebunkport, Maine, a brutal nor'easter was churning the Atlantic Ocean into violent waves. Heavy snow slammed against the glass. But inside the private room, the air smelled of wood smoke and roasted duck. A classical trio in the corner was playing a soft arrangement of Vivaldi on their violins. My family was gathered around a massive oak table under a crystal chandelier. There was Arthur, wearing a tailored navy suit that still had the dry cleaner tag inside the collar. Eleanor sat next to him, her fingers covered in heavy gold rings, frantically checking her phone. Regina was draped over the velvet back of a chair, wearing the identical $4,950 silver crystal gown I had paid for with my tax lien transaction. Sitting across from them was Nathaniel Vance, an infamous billionaire hedge fund manager and a ruthless rare book collector. He had a plate of oysters on ice near his elbow and his gold-rimmed reading glasses resting on his placemat. Resting flat on a green velvet display pad between them was Grandpa Silas's crown jewel. It was the 1702 first edition of the General Theory of Navigation, bound in weathered pigskin leather. I could see a faint smudge of dark charcoal dust on the lower corner of the spine. That was the exact mark Grandpa and I had analyzed together with my microspatulas 3 summers ago. Arthur leaned forward, clinking his heavy crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon to gather everyone's attention. He cleared his throat, flashed his practiced, small-town contractor smile, and looked directly at Vance. "Mr. Vance, we are completely honored to pass my late father's incredible legacy into your esteemed hands tonight," Arthur announced loudly. "The full bill of sale is drafted for exactly $420,000, wire transfer to our joint family account." Vance didn't smile. He just reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a sleek, black Mont Blanc fountain pen. "And your older daughter, Cassandra?" Vance asked, his voice sharp and businesslike. "The trust summary mentions a co-curator. She needs to sign before I release the funds." Eleanor quickly let out a loud, dramatic sigh, placing her hand gently over her heart. "Oh, it is a true family tragedy. Mr. Vance," Eleanor whispered, shaking her head as she dabbed her eyes with a napkin. "Our poor Cassandra has been struggling with severe psychological instability up in Boston for 18 months. She is currently staying at an inpatient facility under strict medical evaluation, completely unable to process reality." Arthur nodded right along, looking down at his lap with an expression of fake, heavy parental grief. "It breaks my heart, but she simply doesn't have the mental capacity to handle her grandfather's affairs anymore," Arthur added smoothly. "As her father, I am signing this transfer on behalf of the entire Powell estate to protect her future." Regina let out a small, muffled giggle into her champagne glass. Turning her head away, they were entirely comfortable using a lie about my mental sanity to finalize a fraudulent transaction right in front of a billionaire. Arthur reached out, picked up the heavy pen, and pressed the nib firmly against the white signature line. Right at that exact second, the heavy brass door handles at the back of the private room clicked loudly. The double doors swung open against the wall with a dull thud. There was no shouting, no dramatic screaming, and no tears. I walked straight through the threshold into the bright, warm room. I was wearing a plain, sleeveless black cotton dress, my hair pulled tightly back into a neat, professional bun. My boots made a clean, steady clicking sound against the polished hardwood floor. Walking right beside me was Warren Fletcher, the senior chief notary and head estate clerk for the Essex County Probate Court. Arthur's hand froze entirely on the paper, the black ink leaving a thick, ugly blotch right over his own first name. Eleanor's champagne glass slipped out of her hand, shattering instantly against the mahogany table leg. The dark amber liquid began pooling slowly around Regina's silver satin shoes. The absolute peak of their cheap, desperate greed had just collided head-on with a cold, unstoppable wall of legal reality. I walked right up to the head of the table, stood directly between my father and his buyer, and looked Vance dead in the eye. "The book stays on the table, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice completely calm and level, "and the pen goes back in your pocket." The heavy mahogany doors closed behind me, shutting out the roar of the blizzard. The private dining room went completely dead silent. The only sound left was the steady, loud click of my boots on the polished oak floor. Eleanor's face shifted from pure shock to a mask of absolute rage. She stood up so fast her heavy gold bracelets clattered violently against her crystal water glass. She rushed across the oriental rug, her silver satin high heels digging into the wool. She planted herself right in front of me, her chest heaving underneath her fake fur wrap. "What the hell are you doing here? Cassandra?" she hissed, her voice dropping into a vicious whisper. "This is a private dinner for our family and Mr. Vance. You are acting like a total lunatic. Get your hands off our business and get out right now." She reached out her manicured hands, trying to physically push my shoulder back toward the exit. I didn't flinch, and I didn't take a single step backward. I looked right through her, completely ignoring her glare as if she were made of thin glass. I reached into my black leather work bag and pulled out a thick, navy blue folder. Arthur finally managed to stand up from his chair at the head of the table. His face was completely drained of color, his expensive Mont Blanc pen shaking between his fingers. "Cassandra, stop this embarrassing nonsense immediately," he stammered, trying to sound authoritative. "We are finalizing a major corporate asset transaction with Mr. Vance." Before he could finish his sentence, the silver-haired man beside me stepped forward into the chandelier light. He unbuttoned his wool overcoat, revealing a gold Essex County law enforcement badge pinned to his vest. "Good evening, everyone," Warren Fletcher said, his deep, gravelly New England voice cutting through the tension. "My name is Warren Fletcher, Chief Clerk of the Essex County Probate Court. I am the state-appointed supervisor for the historical estate of Silas Powell." He walked right past Eleanor, laid his own black leather briefcase on the table, and looked directly at the buyer. "Mr. Vance, I am here to formally advise you that this contract negotiation is entirely fraudulent. Arthur Powell has zero legal authority to liquidate these assets. Attempting to remove or purchase any volume from the Silas Powell collection constitutes a Class B federal felony." Nathaniel Vance's eyes went incredibly wide behind his gold-rimmed reading glasses. He didn't look at my father, and he didn't look at Eleanor's panicked expression. Vance was a multi-millionaire hedge fund manager, and men like him do not risk federal prison for an old book. He immediately dropped the Mont Blanc fountain pen onto the table, letting it roll across the white linen cloth. He stood up, took 3 large steps backward away from my father, and raised his hands in the air. "Hold on a second. I had absolutely no idea this property was under a legal dispute," Vance declared sharply. He turned his head toward his personal security guard standing by the window. "Marcus, cancel the wire code and retrieve the certified corporate check from Arthur right now." The guard moved instantly, grabbing the envelope out of my father's frozen, trembling hand. Arthur collapsed back into his velvet chair. looking like a man who had just watched his entire life vanish. Regina covered her mouth with both hands. Her cheap, $4,950 crystal dress catching the bright light as she started to shake. The lie they had spent 3 months building had completely disintegrated in less than 2 minutes. The raw, solid truth had finally entered the room, and it felt like an absolute force of nature. The bright crystal chandelier overhead cast a harsh, white light across the private room. Arthur's face went from pale to a dark, angry purple. Eleanor was trembling so hard her diamond earrings clicked against her neck. Regina collapsed backward onto the velvet sofa, clutching her empty champagne glass as her dream of a Manhattan apartment vanished. Arthur took 2 aggressive steps toward me, his heavy leather shoes thudding against the floor. "You ungrateful little brat," he roared, pointing his shaking finger directly at my face. "I am your father, and that house in Salem belongs to me. Those books belong to this family, and you do not have the right to humiliate me in front of my business associates. How dare you bring a court clerk into my private dinner and betray your own blood?" I stood perfectly still, my arms crossed, looking directly into his bloodshot eyes. I had waited years for this exact confrontation, but I didn't feel fear or anger. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, hard weight of numbers. "I didn't betray anyone. Arthur," I said, my voice cutting through his shouting like a steel blade. "You signed the irrevocable trust agreement 12 years ago, but you never bothered to read the secondary clauses. Page 14 clearly states that the 1702 navigation book cannot be removed from the Salem Library repository without my digital security clearance. Bypack that book into your leather briefcase and crossing the state line into Maine to sell it illegally. You triggered the safety clause. Your life estate for the Salem house is officially terminated as of 4 p.m. this afternoon. The full deed of the property has already been transferred to the Boston Historical Preservation Trust." Arthur froze, his mouth hanging open as he looked at Warren Fletcher, who simply gave him a slow, official nod. Eleanor let out a sharp, hysterical shriek from the back of the room. "That is impossible!" she screamed, her perfect manicure digging into the sofa cushions. "We live there. You can't just throw us out on the street because of an old piece of paper." I turned my gaze slowly toward her, pulling a second manila envelope out of my work bag. "It gets much worse for you, Eleanor," I said, setting the paper flat on the oak table. "Remember that $5,000 emergency medical loan you begged me for 2 weeks ago? The one you claimed was for Arthur's arthritis therapy, but actually spent on Regina's crystal party dress? I didn't wire it to your account. I paid off your 14 months of delinquent property taxes directly to the Essex County Treasurer. This is a certified tax lien certificate under my commercial firm's name. You now owe my company exactly $5,120 plus a statutory 16% interest penalty. According to Massachusetts State Code, you have exactly 24 hours to wire the full amount to my bank. If the transfer does not clear by 5 p.m. tomorrow, I will file for immediate foreclosure and put the remaining furniture up for public auction on the courthouse steps." Arthur sank back into his chair, his hands covering his face as the absolute reality of his financial ruin locked into place. "If you were standing in my boots, watching the parents who lied to your face and left you out in the cold finally lose everything because of their own greed, what would you feel? Would you feel a sense of pity for your broken father? Or would you feel the pure satisfaction of justice? Type pity or justice in the comments right now, because I want to see how you balance the scales when a toxic family finally gets caught in their own trap. If you believe that lies always have an expiration date and that hard work eventually wins. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the final pieces of this ledger. I reached down, picked up Grandpa Silas's 1702 navigation book from the green velvet pad, and carefully slid it into my protective leather case. I fastened the brass buckles, zipped my work bag shut, and looked at my family one last time. "You spent 3 years trying to make me invisible," I said softly, the room completely silent around me. "But you should have checked the numbers first." I turned around, walked out into the cold corridor, and let the heavy doors click shut behind me. Arthur and Eleanor didn't have the cash to pay my tax lien or the resort's breach of contract fees. The 24-hour deadline passed without a single wire transfer hitting my bank account. On the first Tuesday of January, I stood across the street from the old Salem house in my winter coat. The air was freezing, and the slush on Essex Street was turning into dirty gray ice. 2 large white moving trucks from the Historical Preservation Trust pulled up to the curb. 4 state contractors in heavy work boots began carrying out furniture and boxes of clothing. They placed official yellow state foreclosure notices directly on the large Gothic front door. My father, Arthur, stood on the brick sidewalk, holding a dirty cardboard box filled with old golf trophies. He was wearing his old winter jacket, looking 10 years older under the cold winter sun. Eleanor was sitting in the front seat of their rented Ford Focus, sobbing loudly with the window rolled up. Our wealthy neighbors on Essex Street kept walking their dogs past the lawn, slowing down to stare. Mrs. Higgins from next door pretended to sweep her porch just to watch the state put up the orange barricade tape. The local historical board took full legal possession of the house by 2 p.m. that afternoon. The pride and the fake aristocratic lifestyle they spent 20 years polishing completely evaporated on the sidewalk. The fallout didn't stop with the house. It moved down the line like a row of falling bricks. The very next morning, the legal investigative editor at the Boston Globe ran a full piece on the front page. The headline read, "Local construction executive caught in fraudulent historic asset liquidation." Regina's wealthy fiancé saw the article on his iPad before his morning workout. His family owns 3 major commercial auto dealerships across Massachusetts, and they value their public reputation. He texted Regina 2 sentences, canceled her secondary Black American Express card, and called off the June wedding. Regina had already signed a lease on a luxury apartment in Manhattan, counting on the book money for the deposit. With her credit score destroyed and the family accounts frozen, she had to pack her bags and move back to a small rental room. She now works 45 hours a week as a junior salesperson at a used Honda dealership on Route 1. She spends her days trying to hit a monthly quota just to pay off the $18,000 credit card debt from her silver crystal party dress. 2 days later, my phone buzzed while I was sitting in my Boston office sorting through old library inventory sheets. The caller ID showed an unknown number from a local area code in Lynn, Massachusetts. I picked it up and held the phone quietly to my ear without saying hello. I heard the loud, heavy roar of highway traffic in the background and the sound of cold wind slapping against glass. Arthur was calling me from a rusty public payphone outside a gas station on the bypass road. He was sobbing so hard he could barely breathe into the receiver, his voice cracking completely in the cold air. "Cassandra, please, you have to help us. We are staying in a cheap motel near the highway," he cried. "Eleanor is sick, and Regina won't even look at me because the bank took the Cadillac back. I made a terrible mistake, but I'm still your father, and family is supposed to stick together when the world gets tough. Just give me one single chance to make things right with you. Let's just start over again as father and daughter." I sat at my clean desk, listening to his heavy, pathetic breathing for 2 full minutes. He didn't ask if I had enough money for my groceries, and he didn't ask how I felt when they left me out of Christmas. He didn't even mention Grandpa Silas's name, or apologize for calling me a lunatic in front of Nathaniel Vance. He was only crying because his fake kingdom had collapsed and his lifestyle caved in under the weight of his own debt. He didn't miss his oldest daughter. He just missed the security of my savings account and my professional credentials. I didn't yell at him. I didn't let out a single sigh, and I didn't waste my energy on an angry speech. I calmly lowered the phone, tapped the red end call button with my thumb, and went into my contact settings. I added the number to my permanent block list, turned the screen face down, and picked up my pencil. The ledger was completely balanced. The debt was paid in full, and the cost of their deceit was finally settled. The first cold week of January felt entirely different from the rest of my life. The state legal teams had finished processing the asset transfer paperwork by Monday afternoon. I drove down Essex Street in Salem around 10 a.m. on a bright, crisp Thursday morning. The moving trucks were completely gone, and the heavy state police barricade tape had been removed from the lawn. The old Gothic mansion sat quietly under the pale winter sun, surrounded by patches of melting white snow. I walked up the creaking wooden porch steps, carrying my heavy leather field bag over my shoulder. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy, oil-rubbed iron key with the square head. I slid the key straight into the brass lock of the heavy east wing entrance door. The iron turned smoothly inside the tumblers with a deep, solid click that echoed inside the hallway. The heavy oak door swung open, letting out a soft, familiar puff of cedar dust and old beeswax. The long hallway was completely empty, stripped of Eleanor's fake orchids and her expensive soy candles. But the east wing remained exactly the way my grandfather Silas and I had left it years ago. Bright winter sunlight streamed through the tall, stained glass windows on the south wall. Thousands of tiny golden dust motes danced quietly in the warm beams of light. The long rows of floor-to-ceiling cedar bookshelves stood solid and untouched along the walls. The air smelled rich, like dried linen, old glue, and aged pigskin leather. This entire wing was now legally registered under my name as the executive director of the new Silas Powell Heritage Trust. Arthur and Eleanor's names were permanently erased from the county property records. I walked over to the massive mahogany work desk in the center of the room and unbuckled my bag. I carefully pulled out the 1702 first edition of The General Theory of Navigation. The old pigskin cover felt cool and reassuringly solid against my bare hands. I carried the volume over to the third shelf on the back wall, right next to the window. This was the exact spot where Silas kept his most valuable colonial maritime collection. As I slid the heavy volume back into its original slot between two leather binders, my finger caught on the shelf edge. The movement shook the spine of the 1702 book slightly against the cedarwood partition. A small, folded piece of thick, yellowed wax paper slipped out from behind the hollow cavity of the leather binding. It fluttered quietly through the air and landed flat on the worn oriental rug near my boots. I frowned, knelt down on the wooden floorboards, and picked it up with 2 fingers. I had scanned this exact book 4 separate times during my college apprenticeship years ago. I had checked every single page layout, every margin line, and every heavy paper hinge with my micro spatula. But Silas had tucked this specific note deep inside the inner spine lining where no scanner could ever reach it. I carefully unfolded the brittle wax paper under the bright window light. The message inside was written in faded brown iron gall ink, using Grandpa Silas's shaky, cursive handwriting. The date at the very top of the scrap paper was October 14th, 2014. That was the exact week Arthur had hired a corporate appraiser to put a price tag on the library. To my dearest Cassandra, the ink text read, "You are the only person who sees the true history in these old pages, while the rest of this family only sees a $sign. They will spend their lives trying to measure your worth by how much money they can take from your pockets. Do not let them change your mixed design, and do not let them crowd your workspace. Your name is not on their holiday guest list because your name belongs on the deed to this entire house. Keep your boundaries solid, Cassandra, because the truth doesn't need their permission to stand up. I love you, Grandpa Silas." I sat flat on the floor in the quiet sunlight, holding the scrap of wax paper tightly against my palm. A deep, overwhelming wave of calm washed over my chest, like a cold weight lifting off my ribs. Silas had never been confused by their gaslighting, and he had never believed their dramatic lies. He had seen my long, silent hours of work in this room, and he had built an invisible wall around me 12 years ago. I didn't feel any lingering anger toward Arthur, and I didn't care about Eleanor's desperate phone calls from her motel room. The silence inside the library didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt completely light, clean, and free. I stood up, walked over to his old mahogany chair, and sat down at the head of the desk. I placed his final note inside my personal desk planner, picked up my reading glasses, and opened my journal. I was finally sitting at my own table, and the foundation was absolutely unbreakable. The morning sun was finally warm enough to melt the thick ice on my windowsill. I sat at Grandpa Silas's massive mahogany desk, holding my favorite ceramic mug with both hands. The black coffee was hot, steaming, and tasted exactly the way I liked it. Outside the tall stained glass windows, the heavy snow in the Salem garden was turning into clear water. A blue jay landed on the stone birdbath, shaking its wet feathers in the pale winter light. The house was completely quiet now, free from Eleanor's constant screaming and Arthur's fake contractor speeches. The long shelves of the East Wing held the entire history of our family, and every single volume was exactly where it belonged. I reached out and ran my fingers over the dry, textured leather spine of the 1702 navigation book. The small piece of wax paper with Grandpa's handwriting was tucked safely inside my leather desk planner. My father and stepmother had built a mountain of lies just to trade this room for a quick payout at a luxury resort. They thought my silence meant I was too weak to stand up to their demands or look at their numbers. But in the end, their own greed had pulled the trigger on the trap Silas had set for them 12 years ago. They were currently sitting in a cheap 2-star motel off the state bypass road, counting their remaining dollar bills. Regina was standing on her feet for 9 hours a day at a used car lot, selling vehicles she used to look down on. They had spent 3 full years trying to push me out of their lives, and now they were completely locked out of mine. Yesterday afternoon, Warren Fletcher sent an official courier packet directly to my desk. Inside was a certified bank draft from the Commercial Legal Division in New York City. Nathaniel Vance had formally canceled his transaction with Arthur, but he did not walk away from the collection. He was so incredibly impressed by my technical preservation report and my strict legal boundaries on Christmas Eve that he decided to bypass my father completely. The draft was a non-refundable corporate endowment grant for exactly $200,000 made out directly to the Silas Powell Heritage Trust. Vance wrote a small, personal post-it note and stuck it right to the front of the official check. It read, "The Eastern District needs more conservators who protect the integrity of the foundation. Keep the books clean. Cassandra." That money was already deposited into our long-term capital reserve account, completely safe from any family debt collection lawsuits. I took a slow, quiet sip of my coffee and let out a long breath, feeling the absolute triumph of dignity inside my chest. I am addressing this directly to every single one of you watching this video right now, especially those who have given your entire life to people who only treat you like an unpaid liability. If you are an older parent or a relative sitting at a table where your own children or family members look right through you, listen to my voice very carefully. You do not owe your peace, your hard-earned savings, or your personal dignity to toxic people just because they share your last name. They will call you ungrateful. They will use your kindness as an open ATM, and they will try to make you feel guilty for setting boundaries in your own home. They will spend your money in their heads, lie to your face about emergencies, and treat your silence like a blank check for their own validation. But your worth was never theirs to estimate, and you do not need their permission to pack your bags, change your locks, or walk away from their table. Stop shrinking your life to keep the peace for people who are entirely comfortable watching you freeze in the rain. You have the absolute right to put a heavy lock on your door. Protect your assets, and choose who gets access to your space. They spent 3 seasons making sure I wouldn't find out about their plans. And in the end, they found out I owned the whole house. A real legacy is not a handout from people who despise your work. It is the unbreakable structure you build with your own clean hands. If the story of Cassandra Powell reminded you of your own strength tonight, take a second to hit the like button, subscribe to her dignity stories, and leave a comment below. I read every single line you write, and your stories are the true foundation of this community. If you want to see how other ordinary people stood their ground against impossible families, click on the video on your screen right now to watch the story of a daughter who blocked a fraudulent family wedding contract. Next week, I am going to share a completely unbelievable situation about a family that tried to use a fake medical diagnosis to seize an elderly grandmother's property in Pennsylvania, and the single receipt that blew the entire scheme wide open. You do not want to miss that analysis, so make sure your notifications are turned on. Thank you for sitting with me in the library tonight. Leave the noise behind, and I will see you next week.